Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The Shadow knows.
This is the Shadow.
My hypnotic power has clouded your mind.
The Shadow!
Yes, the Shadow.
I'll be there in every empty room, as inevitable as your guilty conscience.
Because her name is Justice, and her revenge for your mockery will be death.
Agents of the Shadow report for another two-fisted edition of the Shadowcast, the only podcast on the internet devoted exclusively to the immortal exploits of the original Dark Knight of pulps, radio, and comics, The Shadow. And in this inaugural season of The Shadow entitled Birth of a Dark Legend, we are, of course, exploring notable firsts in the history of the Dark Avenger. But today's episode is not only a prominent first for The Shadow, but also for the soon-to-emerge superhero genre at large, what may well be the first appearance of an honest-to-goodness supervillain, the Voodoo Master, voted the best Shadow pulp by readers of the Shadow magazine all the way back in 1937, I think, the same year Orson Welles took the role on radio. I think it also happens to be a fine story in its own right. Before that, we should really talk about, like, the idea behind the supervillain. Really, this was inevitable. When you look at the way that Walter B. Gibson wrote the pulps, he was eventually going to wind up here. Whether this was by design or not, we'll never really know. Unfortunately, he passed away in, I think, 1985. Lived a very long, very full life and certainly affected pop culture. Rest in peace, sir. But I believe either way, he would have wound up at this formula. Eventually, he would have landed on the idea of a supervillain because of the way that he kept meticulous records. We'll talk about this a little bit more later in the podcast, but he had like a filing system, basically, for all of his characters. And essentially what that facilitated was returning characters. Now, granted, he would usually, because he was a good pulp writer, he would put some kind of explanation of where this person came from. He wouldn't just plop a character out of the blue, because a lot of times these stories were published out of order, as we'll talk about. And so, but he would make sure that people were up to speed, but it was great because there were recurring allies, and eventually there were recurring villains. In fact, I believe one of the very first villains that the Shadow fought, and indeed Diamond Burt, would come back, and that was sort of the first stone. We talked about this in the very first episode, the very first example of him exploring this idea of recurring villains, and ultimately that culminates in the supervillain. I guess I have to make a distinction here of what a supervillain actually is in this context. Like, sure, we'd had Professor Moriarty and others in the dime novels of the 19th century, even a few that were owned by Street and Smith themselves. As I've mentioned several times, Nick Carter, the popular dime novel detective, actually predated Sherlock Holmes by a year, and he was owned by Street and Smith, the same company that published The Shadow. But a supervillain, I think, is a cut above a simple criminal mastermind. The implication here is that a supervillain is an offender uniquely positioned to match the titular protagonist in an even fight. And while that couldn't necessarily be said of the Voodoo Master, at least not in a contest of, say, fist-fighting or marksmanship, it certainly could be said of the Voodoo Master's Machiavellian mind, which, for my money, works every bit as efficiently toward illicit activity as the Shadow's does toward justice. Before we move on, of course, I have to apologize for the lengthy absence of this podcast. I was very, very ill for about a month almost, and so I couldn't do much of anything. I was lucky to get the few videos I got out at all, and unfortunately I had one Shadow podcast in the can and sort of put that one together in the meantime. But man, it's been a while since I cranked out a Shadow podcast, and I'm aware of that, but we are back on the horse here, and hopefully that won't happen again. Hopefully we have herd immunity, as it were. We won't mess with the current events in the world because God knows you guys are getting enough of that on radio and in podcasts and on television. So let's tear right into the shadow, shall we? Because I know a lot of you are stuck home. You don't have a lot to do. You've probably gone through your backlog of video games and movies. Heck, you're probably already sick of your movies at this point and of binging TV shows. So I know you don't have a whole lot to do except sit home and consume home media. And what better than pulps? Nice short stories. You can literally finish these in an afternoon. You can just sit there in your armchair and blow through one, and what a great one to get through. I highly recommend it. The Shadows story, The Voodoo Master, as I said, voted the best shadow pulp in 1937. That was the peak, I think, of the Shadows' popularity there in the late 30s and early 40s. He was as big, arguably bigger, than superheroes of really the finest vintage are even now. I mean, bigger than Superman is now in some ways. It just kind of depends on how you define it. Radio achieved greater penetration during its heyday than television ever did in its heyday. I mean, what would the peak of television be? Maybe the 80s, 90s? Something like that. Then steadily, as the internet came into being, those numbers started plummeting downward. So that would probably, I would assume, be the peak. But even in the heyday of television, it was mostly confined to the home. And during the peak years, the 80s and 90s, you might have multiple television sets in a home, but you certainly wouldn't often see them in a car. Yes, there were car televisions, but for numerous reasons, they never really took off. I had a friend with a conversion van that had a television and monitor. It wasn't the best thing. You know what I mean? It looked like something out of Blade Runner. So, that never really took off. However, radio during its heyday was everywhere. You would have multiple radios in a home, then you would have a radio in your car, then you would be walking down the street and you would hear radio playing out of windows. I mean, during its true prime, radio as a formula achieved far greater market penetration, and not by a small amount, folks. So the idea that The Shadow was one of the top-rated programs in the 30s, what I'm getting at here is, yes, he was on top in radio, but radio was on top of everything at the time. So understand the context. When I say The Shadow was bigger in his heyday than Batman is now in, I suppose, his heyday. I don't know. It's been a while since the last movie. But let's look at the Dark Knight era. When we say The Shadow is bigger than that, it's not like my dad could beat up your dad. I'm measuring that against what each format sort of achieved in terms of dominance within the greater cultural sphere. The Shadow was a household name. It's no exaggeration. There's a reason all throughout the 50s and 60s you see a lot of stand-up comics and the cartoonists using Lamont Cranston jokes and the Shadow jokes. He was really a pop culture icon that, we honestly don't really have much to compare that to in the present day because we're so decentralized, even within the context of pop culture. And speaking of radio, there are really two major versions of The Shadow, and that is, of course, radio and pulp, as I've talked about in the past. On radio, for simplicity's sake, he was very clearly established as Lamont Cranston, wealthy young man about town. In the pulps, he is, of course, as we'll later get into, he's Kent Allard, hero of the Great War, a World War I ace known as the Dark Eagle, and an espionage operative for, I believe, the French behind enemy lines. However, this distinction was not spelled out explicitly until Walter B. Gibson wrote a pulp story called The Shadow Unmasks, in response to the Orson Welles radio show taking to the airwaves in 1937. And so this is actually an example of a story written during that crucial, almost 7-year period where, for all the reader knew, The Shadow was Lamont Cranston, even in the pulps. And the Voodoo Master actually offers several excellent examples of how this was handled by Walter B. Gibson. I'll now read from a chapter. At 3 o'clock the next afternoon, Dr. Rupert Sayre was seated in Lamont Cranston's library perusing a rare book that dealt with voodoo rituals. A streak of blackness hovered above the page. Sayre looked up quickly, then smiled as he saw the tall figure of Lamont Cranston. Again, Sayer knew that this was the Shadow, and with good reason. The Shadow's left arm was bandaged and in a sling. Dr. Sayer himself had bandaged it last night. The Shadow had come back to New Jersey after the flight of Dr. Mocquino. As that passage suggests, the Voodoo Master marks the second appearance of Dr. Rupert Sayer, who was enlisted as an agent of the Shadow during the events of another excellent pulp, The Master of Death, which also pertains to the existence of zombies. This is an example of how Walter B. Gibson handled continuity in the Shadow magazine. He kept meticulous records of characters who moved in and out of the Shadow's adventures. He organized them by status and affiliation. He actually put them on little note cards. And if they fit the bill for a given story, he'd go through his files and he'd just drag them out of mothballs and appropriate them for the events of a given novel. This means that while you can read Shadow pulps out of order, and certainly Gibson was an able enough writer to know how to fill you in on any details that might be pertinent to the plot regarding those characters in previously established continuity, if you do read them in order, a deeper continuity emerges. Unfortunately, because of the narrative sausage factory that is the pulps of that era, some of these stories were not published at the time they were written, and so some events are simply out of order. In that connection, for the particularly devoted agent of the Shadow, may I take a moment to recommend Rick Lie's excellent timeline of the Shadow's exploits, Chronology of Shadows. It is available on Amazon. I think it's like $5 for the Kindle version. Very, very cheap. It places each individual pulp story in its appropriate time frame using contextual clues from the text and even occasionally the words of Walter B. Gibson himself, who absolutely kept track of such things during his long writing career. Speaking of supervillains and sort of the enduring impact, because this is maybe more than any single pulp in the Shadow's canon, this novel, whatever quality you may ascribe to it in terms of how good it actually is as a story, has impacted modern superhero storytelling more than any other, simply because it is employing a device that is now used ad astra, the idea of the supervillain. But when you compare it to modern stories, the Voodoo Master really brings into focus how far superhero storytelling, especially in comics and comic films, has fallen. Like, many modern comics have this habit of introducing a mysterious villain, pitting them against the protagonist, then they build up to this big, overblown, elaborate, gimmicky reveal, wherein it turns out to be some obscure figure from the hero's past, and I'm sure the phrase, "we're not so different, you and I," will be uttered at some point. Here I could name about 100 Batman stories, almost all of which are bad. But here, Walter B. Gibson turns that formula on its head before it's even really a formula. We instead reveal the supervillain's secret identity, that the Voodoo Master is not just the Voodoo Master, he's Rodil Mocquino, in the opening scene. And everything after that is merely establishing the menace. And it's remarkably effective here. You don't actually have that much mystery surrounding the Voodoo Master over the course of this story, but the way they handle it is really, really excellent. Before we go, obviously with modern sort of societal mores, you're going to get into, well, it's a voodoo character, so we're always going to consider that, I suppose, problematic in the modern day. But the way they handle it, one thing you realize reading these stories is Walter Gibson was way ahead of the curve on a number of levels. I mean, we will talk in the future about Jericho Druk, who was an African-American agent of the Shadow. Yeah, he speaks in sort of the pidgin dialect that was actually typical of people in that economic sphere at that time, and even without even getting into race, it was a very common way for people to speak. It was actually like their form of language. So calling that, something problematic in the modern day is, I always have an issue with people who project modern sensibilities upon a story from 1930 or 40 or even from before. It always seems to rub me the wrong way. And I think the principal reason is just this ageless egotism that we have it all figured out in the present. Like, if we had that belief in the 1700s, we would still be doing leechings. I just always have an innate aversion to that sensibility. But the Voodoo Master doesn't even go there, honestly. It does talk a few times about him having dark-faced servants, and so the implication there is that there's sort of these, these big African or islander kind of henchmen who have spears and stuff like that. Obviously, you could see clear problematic elements in that. But I think they're actually intended to be Latin islanders, if I'm not mistaken. I'd have to go back and actually check again. This is fairly fresh in my mind, but I can't remember if they actually stipulate precisely where they're from. I do know that Rodil Mocquino, the Voodoo Master himself, is described as coming from there. And so you're already sort of sidestepping, in other words, the Baron Samedi, James Bond kind of live and let die portrayal of voodoo. And you're doing so fairly handily, actually. Again, Walter Gibson, it's pretty surprising all these decades later how ahead of his time he actually was. Again, he would have Asians who were not necessarily agents. Actually, there was an Asian agent. What am I saying? There was more than one, in fact. And they were not handled in sort of stereotypical fashion, even though often one of the principal criticisms of Walter Gibson's stories in terms of modern sensibilities toward ethnicity is the way that he handled Asians. You have to understand this is the way stories were written at the time, and within the context of his time period, Walter B. Gibson was actually being fairly progressive within that context. The idea here is that they come in contact with a young man who is zombified, and I love it. It's a classic example of Walter B. Gibson's approach to Mysterioso writing, which is on full flower here in The Voodoo Master. There are some excellent prosaic segments in this story, and a lot of it comes from this mystery and intrigue around the idea of voodoo. And is this Voodoo Master actually, like, this voodoo cult arrayed around him? Clearly they think he has some kind of supernatural power. What is it? Well, of course, in a Walter B. Gibson story, it's always a whole lot of hoo-ha, and then you sort of peek behind the curtain and realize that, there's an allusion to it. Of course there would be. Walter B. Gibson was an illusionist by trade for many years and loved prestidigitation. In the process of examining this young man who Rupert Sayre just can't seem to figure out, even though he's theoretically an expert on this, he ultimately has to rely on Lamont Cranston, who comes in, and immediately we establish, okay, this is not just Lamont Cranston. There's something else going on here. Rupert Sayre already kind of knows because of his previous dealings. And of course, Lamont Cranston, with his deductive prowess, goes ahead and examines the boy for a long period of time, eventually is able to snap him out of his state in a very, very well-written sequence. And we learn that he is Stanton Wallace, and that he is aware of the impending assassination of one Dunley Blyg. They don't ever say how you pronounce it, but I'm going to go with Dunley Blyg. And he is going to be assassinated at a particular time, and of course the boy's been in a trance state so long that he doesn't realize that he doesn't have as much time as he thinks he does. So Lamont Cranston leaves him with Rupert Sayre so that he can go do his shadow thing, and he tells him, don't let him look at today's paper. And again, in a very well-written sequence, again, ever a student of detail, he asks the servant, can he see the previous day's paper? And so he gets a hold of the previous day's paper. He realizes the date is wrong. He puts two and two together and basically fouls up the plans of the Shadow. Again, just Walter B. Gibson, I love the way his mind worked. You can have whatever criticism you like of his prose. I happen to think it was excellent, certainly by the standards of the day. I think he's one of the most important American writers if you really measure for cultural impact. But I just love the way he wrote detail into his stories. Not so much, I mean, this isn't even really a mystery story, right? You certainly have mystery shadow stories, lots of them, in fact, and Gibson himself talked about the different formulas of shadow stories that he would use, whether it's the mystery or the gangster story, or, in this case, the supervillain story. This is definitely more of a supervillain action story than a mystery. But the way that he finds a way to weave something in to a chapter that you may not have seen originally, you can really tell like why he was such an effective illusionist as well. This story also includes a appearance from Clyde Burke, the news reporter and agent of the Shadow, who sadly I find rarely has a position of significant importance in many of these stories, but here he's actually fairly crucial to the early sequence where Dunley Bligh is saved from assassination by arriving on a ship in his guise as Lamont Cranston, along with Clyde Burke, who I believe is the reason why he's able to be on the ship, if I remember correctly. So the Shadow sort of foils the works at the 11th hour in a really, really cool sequence of gunplay. Actually, very well written. You have to be really careful with writing action, especially in pulps, which are so plot-driven. You can't focus so much on emotion, so you have to get into the mechanics of where people are standing and where the shot is going, and sometimes that can get very cluttered, and mentally it can be hard for the reader to really keep track of. And sometimes the Gibson stories do get bogged down in that. If I have one major criticism of Gibson, it's that. But here, they're really, really well arranged. There's a plot where they're going to have this guy take his medicine, basically overdose on his medicine, and then they're going to come into his cabin and steal some gems, a very popular plot device for Walter B. Gibson, and indeed many pulps of that era. It's not a phenomenon particular to Gibson, wherein the Shadow gets to him first and finds a way to foil the plan, and I'll now read from that. Both men stooped beyond Bligh. Eager fingers reached for sparkling stones. Hands halted suddenly, as if the gems were hot coals. Borey and Hummer spun about. Their lips coughed oaths. A creepy laugh had shuddered to their ears. They saw the being who had uttered that whispered taunt. The Shadow. Thugs by profession, Borey and Hummer recognized the figure that had stepped deliberately into the light. They stared helplessly. Slowly they shifted upward, raising their hands. Terror gripped their evil faces. They thought that Bligh was dead, that the Shadow had found them with a victim. Slowly the Shadow circled, his gun muzzles looming toward the crooks. He neared the outer door. He drew the staring faces away from Bligh's direction. Peering along the floor, the Texans saw the move. He came up to a half-seated position, gripping his revolver. The Shadow had left the outer door unlocked. He was approaching it, to hold his position there while he dealt with these two murderous men. He was not quite to the door when he stopped. At that moment, the door swung open. A white-coated man appeared in the light. It was Hoke. Behind him, another thug, the man called Dill. The pair had also heard Bligh's fall. They had come to join Borey and Hummer. The Shadow hissed a command to Bligh. He was to pounce upon Borey and Hummer while the Shadow dealt with this new duo. Bligh misunderstood the order. He caught a motion of Hoke's gun. Quick on the trigger, the Texan aimed for the white-jacketed crook. The revolver roared. Hoke staggered. It's aided a bit, and granted, you need a little bit of background there. He obviously catches the guy who was supposed to overdose, the Texan with the gems, and he tells him to sort of play dead, essentially, and then comes into the room, and when everybody shows up, the Shadow obviously is lying in wait. But the way that it's drawn, it's really, really, really very effective. You actually understood basically where everybody was standing in that situation. Sometimes that's not necessarily the case in these Shadow stories, and it's aided immeasurably by the artwork. Gosh, I have meant to mention this in several of these podcasts, but oh my goodness, the artwork of Tom Lavelle. There's a really good illustration in particular from Tom Lavelle here. I have to say, there are people who are really hot on Ed Cartier as an interior illustrator for the Shadow magazine. I know Mike Kaluta, his iteration of the Shadow is heavily inspired by that, but man, Tom Lavelle, for my money, was the best illustrator that ever drew the Shadow. The amount that he can do with so little line is incredible. Anyone who's ever drawn anything, I've of course had comics published and stuff. I'm far from a professional, but I have had stuff published in anthology magazines, and I can tell you, as an artist, it is not easy to render something purely on the basis of value, which is really what he does. And of course, Tom Lavelle would go on to be a very famous and quite affluent painter, from what I understand, because of his renderings of the Old West and of the Civil War, and so he would do these big, vivid paintings. But here, he's employing a purely pulp style. These are sketches. These are ink sketches, and they're just spot on. And the way that he renders this scene really gives you a sense of where everything is in space. And that helps a lot when you're reading these stories. But Clyde Burke is not alone as one of the agents of the Shadow featured in this story. Miles Crofton, who's also a bit of a plot device character as agents go, he gets in on the action as the Shadow's autogyro pilot. And actually, in keeping with our theme of prominent firsts, this is the first appearance of the wingless variant of the Shadow's autogyro as well, meaning basically this cat's got a helicopter now. That's basically what this is. There's no wings on this now, so it's basically a chopper. Canonically, for some reason, this appears to have been shorn away from the Shadow's arsenal, as I've noticed modern takes on the character still, for some bizarre reason, include the winged autogyro in all the interior and cover art. I'm thinking back now to the Shadow Year 1. That, I believe, had wings on it. At least in comics, I noticed this happens. Which, I mean, fair enough. If you're steering into the whole diesel punk thing, wings seem, I guess, incrementally more kitsch than wingless autogyros. But now I feel like I'm having the boneless wings debate all over again. Look, I've talked about the difference between the Shadow and the Punisher. And I really want to get to the climax of this story, because I don't want to spoil the plot. I really want you guys to read this. But this is really, for anyone who doesn't want spoilers, don't listen to the next 5-6 minutes, because I really want to talk about the climax here, because this is a classic example of what I've talked about a million times, where, you know, I think unfortunately the longer the Shadow remains outside the pop culture consciousness, the easier it becomes to sort of conflate the two. He becomes the 40s Punisher. I think that syndrome was definitely present in the Garth Ennis comics, largely, I think, due to the novelty of having a vigilante like the Punisher popping caps and criminals, basically during an era when superheroes have been, shall we say, softened to cater to contemporary mores. But the Shadow, he is not the Punisher, because he doesn't just kill the baddies. As I've said a dozen or more times, he is after the moral, the symbolic victory. Very, very rarely does the Shadow simply shoot the guy and jolly on back to his inner sanctum. No, he engineers a more elaborate demise, because as Walter Gibson said, I think more than once, and I've echoed for what little it's worth, the Shadow is intended to be a white hat in a black hat. The Shadow is evil, visited upon evil. Make no mistake, his morality is completely virtuous. He is a white hat to the max, but his philosophy is that once that moral binary has been breached by a criminal, any reprisal on his part is fair game. The more fitting, ruthless, and elaborate, the better. I've used the ending of the Hydra as an example in the past, but the Voodoo Master is a crystal clear example of this philosophy in practice. Again, here's the spoiler segment. So it turns out that the Voodoo Master is not in fact using voodoo powers to turn people into zombies. He is using oversensitization through color shock, which is a legitimate psychological practice, although it's handled in somewhat hokey fashion here. Basically, the idea is that people are oversensitized by loud music and by being surrounded by the color red for a long period of time. And so he has these bright red lights and a room that is covered in red tapestries, and he just leaves them there with these loud voodoo drums throbbing in their ears for hours and even days on end. And eventually they just lose all touch with reality. They have a complete psychic break, and they are effectively insensate at that point. Really interesting plot device. And so how does the Shadow bring the Voodoo Master to justice? He infiltrates his secret lair. I will not divulge the details of what that secret lair actually is, because it's actually kind of novel and interesting. And he infiltrates it. He actually disguises himself as one of his regular occurring characters, Fritz, the janitor. And then he changes suddenly into a completely different garb. He doffs his slouch hat and cape, his black slouch hat and cape, and he removes all red garments. And you can see where this is going. So the Voodoo Master heads into the room, and suddenly his men start dropping like flies. And I will now read that incredible passage. The door of the Red Room swung open. Jose Arrida stood staring into the chamber. Beside Arrida was Manuel. Behind the pair, a cluster of Mocquino's crouching henchmen. The Voodoo Master himself was stalking forward to join the throng. A cry came from Arrida. The fellow pointed. Others saw Harry and Stanton. The prisoners were no longer prone. Halfway to their feet, they were struggling to release themselves from bonds which had somehow become loosened. Arrida remembered Mocquino's order. He spat one word. Kill. As gun hands came up, a fierce laugh burst from within the Red Room. It seemed to come from the vast spaces of that weird chamber, where Harry and Stanton were the only visible persons. The room itself was mocking. Crimson depths were hurling a challenge to Mocquino's startled crew. Kill. Arrida panted the word in defiance of the laugh. Revolvers turned toward Harry and Stanton, who were several feet apart. Mocquino's marksmen were divided in their aim, but they were prepared to deliver death despite their terror. Again, the fierce laugh echoed from the void. Then, in the very center of the Red Room, two guns appeared as if by magic. Those weapons were automatics. They were conjured in midair at a spot where none of Mocquino's henchmen were aiming. Before a single finger could pull a revolver trigger, the suspended automatics blazed. Each .45 was withering. The aim of those weapons was incredible. They must have been held by living hands, even though such fists were invisible, for bullets found the bodies of Mocquino's henchmen. Arriba sprawled. Manuel fell beside him. Others driving forward forgot the prisoners and aimed for the floating guns instead. The automatics had the bulge. Like living creatures handling themselves, they pointed, fired, then recoiled. The doorway cluttered with Mocquino's henchmen. Half a dozen were flattened before the others dived away for cover. That open door meant death. Mocquino knew it, and his hiss was venomous. The voodoo doctor had also leaped aside, but he had reached the wall outside the Red Room. His fingers clicked a switch. The lights of the Red Room were controlled from either side of the wall. Mocquino's action changed the glare. Ruddy bulbs faded. Ordinary light replaced them. The Red Room was a void no longer. It had become a crimson-walled compartment. Sayre, the only one in position to see within, was astonished by the sight before him. A figure stood in the very center of the room, a cloaked shape with collar upward, a shape that wore a down-turned slouch hat with gloved hands that gripped those dreaded automatics. It was the figure of the Shadow, but changed. The Shadow was not clad in black. Hat, cloak, and gloves were crimson. A red shadow. Now, anyone who knows anything about stage magic, which I know remarkably little, knows what trick was employed here, and of course you can see where Walter Gibson got it from. I remember when I was in kindergarten, there was a puppet show troupe that used this trick. They had these really cool, actually, these like talking cactus puppets. And what did they do? They performed the whole thing. They were very elaborate, and so they had to actually stand behind the puppets. I think they were operated more like, not like marionettes, but like an actual ventriloquist dummy or something. You actually had to stand next to them to operate them. So they had a black background, and they simply wore all black that covered their entire bodies, right? They wore like a black bodysuit. So this is an old stage trick, right? This is as old as the hills, folks. And so he's basically doing this, but with redness. You can see where Gibson would have extrapolated from this. And this is an example of Gibson's incredible mind. He was always looking for a good gag for the Shadow, always. Apparently, when this story was written, the Voodoo Master, already the editors could see like this was going to be a very popular character. They could see that they wanted this guy to show up again. And so they literally rewrote the ending, or had Walter Gibson rewrite the ending so that it could leave open the possibility that he survives. I won't get into what his fate exactly is in this story. I want you guys to read it. If you liked any of this, highly recommend you grab the double novel, which is as of this moment is still available, although at the end of this year they will no longer be available. The Sanctum reprints, it is printed along with another excellent story with a one-off villain that probably should have showed up again called the Red Blot. And I love both of these stories. These are two of my absolute favorites, and they're packed into one double novel, along with the original artwork and some extra background information. The Voodoo Master is one of my favorite pulp stories, maybe my absolute favorite pulp story. I don't know about that one. I think Hydra might be my favorite. We'll see. As we go along with these, and believe me, I have not read all of these. I've read over, I think, 100, but I haven't read all of them. As we go through, I may find a new favorite, but as of now, this is certainly in my top 5, probably my top 3. So highly, highly, highly recommend The Shadow, the Voodoo Master. Which brings us to the apropos radio episode that we're going to review this week, and that is, of course, Voodoo. Also, an extremely popular episode of the radio show. It was also voted the best episode of the Shadow radio show, although under what circumstances and in what publication that was, I've never been completely able to ascertain, so that may be apocryphal, but I've heard many people mention this episode, so at least tangentially, I know that it's somewhat popular among Shadow fans. I don't know what it is about the subject of voodoo that jives so well with the Shadow. Maybe it's just the innate nature of the character to sort of be surrounded by the seeming supernatural, and then he uses his processes of deduction and investigative techniques to uncover the sleight of hand at play. And so voodoo and other forms of magic just naturally lend themselves to that as a formula. This is a pretty good episode. I won't say it's one of my favorites. It's a Bill Johnstone episode, for one, which never ranks particularly high in my personal pantheon. He did have a few good episodes, but I'm just not a big fan and never have been of his radio interpretation of Lamont Cranston / The Shadow. Actually, I take that back. His Shadow voice is fantastic. His laugh, less so. A lot less so. But his Lamont Cranston voice is really what bugs me. It just doesn't sound like... It sounds like an uncle or something. He sounds too harmless. Not enough. It's hard to get wealthy young man about town from the voice of Bill Johnstone, who was not that old at this time, although he was gray-haired. He went gray-haired very, very early in his life. Bill Johnstone, by the way, outside of Orson Welles, of course... probably had the most successful film career of all the Shadow actors, or maybe John Archer. But Bill Johnstone was in the original film version of the Titanic, which was famously smashed together with A Night to Remember and renamed Titanic by James Cameron, who then won an Oscar for other people's work. I kid somewhat. He had kind of a small role. He's probably better known, at least among soap opera aficionados, as being a recurring judge character on As the World Turns. I think he was also in a film noir that I'm actually a fan of called Down Three Dark Streets. It was a very small supporting role. That was kind of his career. He was supporting guy, character actor, what have you, but he was very, very big in radio. Probably his biggest turn outside of the Shadow would have been The Whistler, which is another very popular sort of mysterioso crime drama on old-time radio. But this particular episode is interesting in that it opens up on a completely unfamiliar environment. You're on an island called Little Cauldron. A very, very subtle name for an island that has a voodoo cult. And Margot is not real high on the inhabitants, I notice.
It's a desolate place. In fact, the Fergus brothers and their sister Polly were the only whites living there. The rest of the population consisted of some 2,000 backward and illiterate natives.
Backward and illiterate? That's giving the natives a break, Lamont.
You see, Major, these natives practiced a peculiar form of voodooism. They worshipped reptiles.
Woo, lad! No sooner do I say, hey, let's not judge entertainment from the 30s and 40s by modern day standards, but frankly, that was a little bit racist even by 1941 standards. But the interesting thing is that the plot is kind of similar to the Voodoo Master in that you have a non-traditional voodoo practitioner who has seized upon the mythology of voodooism to portray himself as some great witch doctor and thereby manipulates those people. But in the Voodoo Master, he's manipulating all kinds of people, not just sort of islanders or natives. He's even manipulating just people in a city, right? He has a cult around him. And in this case, this guy has moved on to the island and decided to manipulate those people. Or actually, it's more factual to say his family already lived there, and he's decided to use their superstitions against them to manipulate the natives and elevate himself to a position of godhood because he's slightly crazy. It's very similar in some ways to the Voodoo Master, but you can see where it diverges, and really the principal way that it diverges is that it's reusing a plot point from a number of other Shadow radio episodes. In fact, there's one that comes to mind called The White Witchman of Leviathan that I think it's from the Orson Welles years, is kind of a similar idea, where there's just a white guy who comes into a native population and manipulates them with this crazy occult mumbo-jumbo. You really do see the limitations of radio. As much as I love old-time radio, you did have, 20-something minutes to get the entire story out, and so it's necessarily compressed. But to give you an idea of just how compressed a radio episode could be, you're not sure who this Caucasian individual is that's manipulating the Islanders, and you're not sure who has killed Edmund Fergus's family, and yet in the very same scene where you're establishing that mystery, you're also answering it.
Who are the natives holding funeral rites for?
Edmund Fergus and his sister Polly. They died earlier this evening.
I see. It's almost dawn.
Why have you come here? You, an escaped murderer?
Listen, I don't know what you've heard about me, but I didn't kill that man on the mainland.
You've been suspected of the crime.
Edmund Fergus put the police on my trail. He did this because he himself was the murderer.
There seems to be a white man leading them, edging them on.
It's Fergus. Edmund Fergus.
He's right, Lamont. It is Edmund. He's alive.
Yes. Yes, I see him now.
Oh!
Quiet. He's shouting something to them.
Follow me! Follow your God who has returned from the grave!
I mean, I did chop that up a little bit just for timeliness' sake, but that is essentially how it goes down. It's in the exact same scene that Edmund Fergus, air quotes, dies, that we establish that Edmund Fergus is in fact leading all of these natives and that he is actually the voodoo cult leader. It's very highly compressed. You could see how a plot like this could probably facilitate, I don't know, a short movie or something, but they smash it together because it's all in radio format. I like this episode really more for the ambiance, really, and the atmosphere than anything else. There's some great background sound effects. I think the radio players, the actual sound effects people on this particular episode did a bang-up job with the jungle drums and the chanting in the background and all this stuff. I'm sure this episode could have been more of a throwaway if those people hadn't been on the top of their game. They did an absolutely superb job. But the basic plot thread is that this Sebastian guy is an accused murderer. He was actually framed by Edmund Fergus, who wanted to kill his family and take this position as this sort of island voodoo god. And so Lamont Cranston, in true Shadow old-time radio fashion, decides that the best plan is for him to feed Margot Lane to the voodoo cult as a sacrifice, because why wouldn't you?
I'll cut her bonds, too.
No, wait. I've just thought of something. Something that has one chance in 1,000 of working, but we must gamble that it will.
What? What is it, Lamont?
You must remain tied up, Margot.
Lamont,
Please trust me, Margot.
And of course, in true 40s melodrama fashion, immediately the voodoo cult show up, and they plan to sacrifice her upon an altar, and Lamont Cranston just ain't showing up. The accused killer, Sebastian, of course, takes over the Shadow role momentarily. We never do explain what took the Shadow quite so long, but either way, we know what's gonna happen to Sebastian, because it ain't like he's a recurring character.
Why doesn't he go? Prepare herself to die. Very well. Very well. I see there's no chance now. You can do with me as you wish.
Don't give up hope.
No, take life! Oh, no, you don't!
The attack for the life. White man, attack for the life.
Got him, I say!
Keep a knife. He's dead for the life.
Get that knife away from him!
He needs that knife. Now give it back to White Man. No! Sebastian, what have they done to you?
You must carry on.
And of course, it being near the end of the episode, we have to have the big Shadow reveal just in time to have not prevented a murder.
By killer!
Something holds in the arm. She cannot strike with knife.
I am preventing you from striking your helpless victim, Senior.
Oh, Who are you? I see no one.
You shall find out soon enough.
Voodoo. That's voodoo magic.
Strike, Zini! Continue the sacrifice. Why do you stand there like that?
Because I have willed her to do so.
Who speaks? Where did that voice come from?
You might know me, Edmund Fergus, as the Shadow.
Classic stuff. Again, similar premise to the Voodoo Master, but understandably much less deep in terms of narrative, and certainly didn't deepen the lore of the radio show because this guy never shows up, nor does the voodoo cult, although different voodoo cults and zombies certainly do show up. Pretty much any kind of monster was exhausted by the end of the Radio Shadows run, but it was, sort of a more condensed version of the Voodoo Master, which is why I decided to review it this week. I like it a lot. It isn't among my absolute favorites, and it's certainly more than slightly dated in the present day, but it's all over the YouTubes. You can certainly buy this on disc. I believe they have a new, cleaned up audio version, like a remastered episode of this that was discovered some years back that you can actually pick up. So Voodoo, a fine example of the Bill Johnstone era, which has some of the best and worst Shadow episodes ever recorded. Well, with that, we come to the end of this edition of the Shadowcast. Until next time.
As you sow evil, so shall you reap evil. Crime does not pay. A shadow knows.